Imagine a world where death moved faster than life, where a cough, a swollen lump, or even a faint fever could mean the end within days. Coffin in the mid-14th century, such a nightmare became reality. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, swept across continents and changed the course of civilization forever. But how did it start? And why did it spread with such terrifying speed? Today, we uncover the chilling beginnings of the Black Death. A world on the edge. The early 1300s was a time of transition for Europe. Populations had grown steadily after centuries of relative stability, cities were bustling with trade, and kingdoms were expanding their power. Yet beneath the surface, famine, poverty, and unrest simmered. From 1315 to 1317, the Great Famine ravaged Europe, killing millions through starvation and weakening survivors. Crops failed due to relentless rain and cold temperatures, livestock died, and entire communities struggled to survive. By the time the famine ended, Europe was already fragile. People were malnourished, immune systems were weak, and the stage was set for disaster. Meanwhile, trade routes, both land and sea, were connecting Europe, the Middle East, and Asia more closely than ever. Along these paths of commerce came not only silk, spices, and precious metals, but also invisible stowaways, diseases. The mysterious origins. Historians and scientists debate where the Black Death began. Most evidence points to the plains of Central Asia, possibly near modern-day Kyrgyzstan, where plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, lurked in rodent populations. From there, it spread along trade routes, carried by merchants, travelers, and the fleas that infested black rats. By the early 1340s, outbreaks were recorded in China and the Middle East. In 1346, the plague reached the city of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea, a bustling Genoese trading outpost on the Black Sea. Here, a dramatic and terrifying event would mark the plague's entrance into Europe. The Siege of Kaffa. At Kaffa, the Mongol Golden Horde laid siege to the city. But the besiegers themselves were struck down by the plague. According to one account, the Mongols resorted to a gruesome tactic. They catapulted the bodies of their dead over the city walls, attempting to infect the defenders. Whether or not this was truly the first act of biological warfare, the result was the same: panic and infection spread within Kaffa. When Genoese ships fled the city, they carried more than just cargo, they carried plague victims. These ships became floating coffins, carrying death westward across the Mediterranean. The plague arrives in Europe. In 1347, ships from Kaffa landed in Messina, Sicily. Locals were horrified to see sailors dying in agony, covered in black swellings and spitting blood. The disease spread rapidly from port to port: Genoa, Marseille, Barcelona, each city falling like dominoes. The symptoms were unmistakable and terrifying. Buboes, painful, swollen lumps in the groin, armpit, or neck, darkened by internal bleeding. A fever and chills, leaving victims weak and delirious. Coughing blood, as the pneumonic form attacked the lungs. Blackened skin, leading many to call it the Black Death. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days. In some towns, entire families were wiped out in less than a week. A plague without borders. From Italy, the disease surged outward like wildfire. By 1348, it had reached France, Spain, and England. By 1349, it ravaged Germany and Scandinavia, and by 1350, it struck as far as Russia. No region was spared. Estimates vary, but historians believe the Black Death killed between 75 and 200 million people worldwide, wiping out up to half of Europe's population in just a few short years. Trade routes, once symbols of wealth and connection, became conduits of death. Rats infested ships, fleas clung to clothing, and human interaction spread the disease with terrifying speed. Panic and desperation. As the plague swept across Europe, fear gripped every city, town, and village. Doctors, armed with no more than superstition and primitive tools, were powerless. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal remedies, and prayer, none of which stopped the spread. Religious fervor exploded. Some believed the plague was a punishment from God, while others blamed minority groups, especially Jews, leading to horrific pogroms across Europe. Entire communities were massacred based on fear and ignorance. Meanwhile, flagellant movements emerged, groups of men marching from town to town, whipping themselves in penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. But their rituals only spread the plague further. The collapse of daily life. The impact on society was immediate and catastrophic. Markets and trade collapsed as fear of infection emptied towns. Farms lay abandoned, crops rotting in the fields as peasants and laborers died. Corpses piled up faster than they could be buried, with mass graves dug across Europe. Entire villages disappeared from maps as survivors fled or perished. Chroniclers of the time wrote of cities where the living could barely bury the dead. In some places, dogs and pigs fed on corpses, and the stench of decay filled the air. A world forever changed. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe marked not just a human tragedy, but the beginning of profound transformation. Feudal systems began to crack, economies shifted, and faith in traditional authorities weakened. But all of that, the lasting consequences, the revolutions in thought, the changes in art and science, would come later. In these first years, the focus was only survival. The Black Death had arrived. And it was only the beginning. Cities under siege by disease. By 1348, the Black Death had transformed Europe into a living nightmare. No city, no matter how grand or fortified, could escape its grasp. Florence, one of Italy's wealthiest cities, was devastated. Chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, in his famous Decameron, described horrifying scenes: neighbors abandoning neighbors, families deserting their loved ones, and bodies left in the streets to rot. Wealth offered no protection. Nobles and peasants alike succumbed with equal speed. In fact, crowded cities were the most dangerous places to be. With people packed into narrow streets and poor sanitation everywhere, the plague spread like wildfire. In Paris, the University of Paris faculty gathered to explain the catastrophe. Their conclusion? The alignment of the planets had caused poisonous vapors to descend upon Earth. In London, panic swept through as carts piled high with corpses rolled through the streets. Bells tolled endlessly as priests performed mass burials. Villages abandoned. If cities were overwhelmed, the countryside was not spared. Entire villages in England, France, and Germany simply vanished, abandoned by survivors or wiped out completely. Archaeologists still find lost villages today, settlements deserted during the plague years and never repopulate. In these rural areas, the shortage of labor quickly became apparent. Fields went unplowed, harvests failed, and famine threatened those who had already endured so much. The failure of medicine. Medieval medicine was utterly unprepared. Physicians wore the now famous plague doctor outfits, long robes, gloves, and bird-like masks filled with herbs. They believed that miasma, or bad air, caused the plague, and that fragrant herbs could purify it. But these measures offered little protection. Doctors tried bloodletting, applying leeches, and concocting potions of vinegar and spices. Some recommended sitting between fires to burn away the poison. Others advised drinking mercury, which only hastened death. The lack of effective treatment deepened public despair. Many concluded the plague was divine punishment, beyond human remedy. Scapegoats and persecution. When people cannot explain disaster, they often search for someone to blame. In the case of the Black Death, Jewish communities became the primary scapegoat. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, causing the plague. Massacres followed. In 1349, the Jewish community of Strasbourg was wiped out in a pogrom. Similar atrocities occurred across Germany, Switzerland, and Spain. Tens of thousands of Jews were killed, despite papal decrees attempting to protect them. This wave of persecution left deep scars on Europe's Jewish population and reshaped the demographics of entire regions. Religion in crisis. Religion was both a refuge and a source of turmoil. Many clung desperately to the church, praying for deliverance. Pilgrimages increased, processions filled the streets, and monasteries worked tirelessly to care for the sick. But when prayers went unanswered, trust in the church began to waver. Priests died in large numbers, often abandoning their flocks. Survivors wondered why God allowed such suffering, and this doubt planted early seeds of change that would one day contribute to movements like the Reformation. Meanwhile, the flagellants roamed Europe. These groups, dressed in rags, whipped themselves publicly to atone for humanity's sins. They believed their suffering might appease divine wrath. Instead, their gatherings often spread the plague further, deepening chaos. Political upheaval. The Black Death also shook political systems. Monarchs lost subjects in staggering numbers, reducing tax revenues and military strength. Entire regions fell into instability. In England, King Edward III lost his daughter, Princess Joan, to the plague. Across Europe, rulers were powerless to protect their people, and this eroded faith in both monarchy and nobility. The traditional structures of authority seemed fragile when even kings could not stop the invisible enemy. Economic breakdown. The economic consequences were catastrophic at first. Trade collapsed as merchants feared traveling, markets closed, and ports were quarantined. Ships rotted in harbors, their crews dead. Food supplies dwindled because of labor shortages, driving prices sky high. Craftsmen and farmers died in such numbers that surviving workers suddenly became scarce. Entire industries stalled. But this collapse had an unexpected side effect. With so few workers left, survivors found themselves in high demand. Wages rose dramatically, giving peasants and laborers unprecedented bargaining power. The The foundations of the feudal system, where peasants were bound to lords, began to weaken. Peasant revolts. In the decades after the plague, social unrest boiled over. Lords tried to enforce old feudal obligations, but peasants demanded higher wages and more freedom. In England, this tension exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where thousands rose up against oppressive taxation and feudal restrictions. Though brutally suppressed, the revolt revealed a changing world. The plague had rewritten the social contract, workers realized their value, and feudalism began its long decline. Cultural and psychological impact. The trauma of the Black Death left deep cultural scars. Art and literature became obsessed with death. Skeletons, skulls, and grim reapers filled paintings and church murals in what became known as the Danse Macabre or Dance of Death. Writers like Boccaccio and later Geoffrey Chaucer reflected a world where humor, tragedy, and mortality intertwined. The plague forced people to confront the fragility of life, shaping Europe's cultural imagination for centuries. Beyond Europe. The Black Death did not stop at Europe's borders. In the Middle East, the great city of Cairo lost tens of thousands. Chronicler Ibn Khaldun wrote that entire civilization seemed to vanish. In China, records suggest millions died, weakening the Yuan dynasty. The interconnectedness of the medieval world meant no region was safe. The plague was a truly global catastrophe. Preparing for transformation. By the early 1350s, the first great wave of the Black Death began to subside. Entire communities had been erased, populations cut in half, and the survivors lived in a changed world. But while the immediate effect was destruction, the longer-term consequences would reshape Europe in ways no one at the time could have predicted. Out of the ashes of the Black Death would rise revolutions in economics, culture, science, and society. The medieval world was ending, and something new was beginning. Picking up the pieces. By the mid-1350s, the initial wave of the Black Death had passed. Cities, villages, and kingdoms were left shattered. Entire dynasties had lost heirs, communities were depopulated, and farmlands lay abandoned. Yet in this devastation, Europe began to reorganize. The survivors lived in a world profoundly transformed. They inherited homes, lands, and wealth from the countless dead. With fewer mouths to feed, food supplies stabilized. And for the first time in centuries, ordinary people had leverage. But the scars of the Black Death would linger, not just in memories of mass graves and rotting corpses, but in every corner of society, economy, culture, and belief. Economic transformation. The death of nearly half the population reshaped the economy. Workers were scarce, which meant wages rose dramatically. Lords and landowners, once in total control of peasants, now found themselves bargaining for labor. This led to decline of serfdom. In many regions, peasants simply walked away from the land. With so much land empty, lords couldn't stop them. Serfdom weakened and, in time, nearly disappeared in Western Europe. Rise of a cash economy. Instead of being tied to feudal duties, peasants demanded wages in money. Trade in currency grew, and Europe edged closer to a market economy. Urban growth. Many survivors fled rural life for cities, seeking opportunity. This accelerated urbanization and gave rise to a stronger merchant class. By the late 14th century, Europe's economy was no longer feudal in the old sense. The plague had cracked the system wide open. Political consequences. The shifting balance of power didn't stop at the fields. Monarchs, too, had to adapt. With fewer subjects to tax, they struggled to finance wars and projects. Feudal lords who had once dominated local life found their grip loosening. At the same time, centralized monarchies in countries like France and England began consolidating more power. Strong kings could impose new systems of taxation, build professional armies, and reduce their reliance on feudal levies. Thus, while the plague weakened feudal nobility, it ultimately paved the way for the rise of stronger nation-states. Faith and skepticism. Religion faced one of its greatest tests. The church had been the cornerstone of medieval life, but its failure to protect people from the plague left cracks in its authority. Priests had died in droves, sometimes abandoning their flocks. When prayers and rituals failed to stop the disease, many ordinary people lost faith in the church's power. Some turned to mysticism, astrology, or folk remedies. Others grew cynical, focusing on earthly pleasures instead of divine salvation. The church still remained central, but doubt had been planted. This skepticism would grow in the centuries to come, eventually fueling the Protestant Reformation. A cultural revolution. The Black Death changed how people saw life and death. Art shifted dramatically. The Danse Macabre, Dance of Death murals and paintings showed skeletons leading kings, peasants, and children alike into the grave, reminding viewers of life's fragility. Memento mori, everyday objects like jewelry and books were decorated with skulls and bones as constant reminders of mortality. Literature, writers like Boccaccio, the Decameron, and Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, captured the tension between tragedy and humor in a world haunted by death. But the plague also paved the way for the Renaissance. With populations reduced, wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Survivors, especially merchants in Italy, had the resources to patronize art, science, and learning. The obsession with death paradoxically gave birth to a new fascination with life, human achievement, and discovery. Shifts in warfare. The plague also reshaped how wars were fought. With feudal armies weakened, kings began hiring professional soldiers, mercenaries who fought for pay rather than loyalty. This professionalization of armies led to more organized, devastating wars, including the 100 Years' War between England and France. Yet the same labor shortages that hurt agriculture also limited rulers' ability to fight indefinitely. Warfare became more expensive, requiring new forms of taxation and fueling resentment among peasants, resentment that often boiled over into revolts. Seeds of scientific change. Perhaps one of the most overlooked consequences of the plague was its impact on science and medicine. The Black Death exposed the limits of medieval medicine. Superstitions about bad air and planetary alignments had failed. Desperate for answers, some thinkers began to push for more observation-based approaches. Although germ theory was centuries away, the plague nudged Europe toward questioning old traditions. This spirit of inquiry, combined with cultural shifts of the Renaissance, would eventually lead to breakthroughs in anatomy, biology, and public health. Social upheaval. With so many dead, families and communities were torn apart. Inheritance patterns changed as estates were divided among surviving relatives. Women, in particular, gained new opportunities. Widows inherited lands and sometimes managed them independently. In some towns, women entered trades previously closed to them. Although progress was uneven, the plague cracked open rigid gender and class hierarchies, creating space for social mobility. Global ripple effects. The Black Death's transformation wasn't confined to Europe. In the Middle East, economies struggled to recover. Ibn Khaldun, the great Arab historian, described the plague as a catastrophe that swept away entire generations. In China, the plague struck during a period of political instability, weakening the Yuan dynasty and paving the way for the rise of the Ming. Globally, the plague shifted trade patterns, depopulated key regions, and altered the balance of empires. A changed mentality. Perhaps the most profound change was psychological. Survivors lived with the knowledge that life could end suddenly and without warning. This gave rise to two contrasting worldviews. 1. Fatalism. Some believed nothing could prevent death, so they lived in constant fear or obsession with sin and punishment. 2. Carpe diem. Seize the day. Others embraced life more fully, indulging in pleasures, art, and new ideas. This dual mentality defined late medieval Europe and carried into the Renaissance. The dawn of a new era. By the 15th century, Europe was not the same continent it had been before 1347. The feudal system had weakened, economies had restructured, culture had been reborn, and religion faced mounting challenges. The Black Death had destroyed, but it had also transformed. It acted as a brutal catalyst for change, forcing societies to adapt or collapse. The medieval world was ending. A new Europe, one that would explore, innovate, and eventually dominate the globe, was emerging from the ashes. Echoes of the plague. Although the initial outbreak of the Black Death in the mid-14th century was the deadliest, it was not the end. Plague returned again and again for centuries. Europe never truly rid itself of the disease until modern times. Instead, it learned to live under its shadow. Each recurrence reminded survivors that the world had changed forever. Later outbreaks. The 15th and 16th centuries, plague flared repeatedly, sometimes wiping out a third of local populations. Cities like London, Paris, and Venice lived in constant fear of new waves. The Italian plague, 1629 to 1631, northern Italy lost almost a quarter of its population. The Great Plague of London, 1665, one of the last major outbreaks in England, killing about 100,000 people in a single year. The third pandemic, 1855, originating in China, this wave spread globally, reaching India, Africa, and even the Americas. These outbreaks showed that while the medieval Black Death had ended, plague was never just a medieval problem. Scientific breakthroughs. The mystery of the Black Death wasn't solved until much later. In the late 19th century, French-Swiss scientist Alexander Yersin discovered the bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis. He also identified the flea as the main carrier, usually riding on black rats. This breakthrough finally explained what medieval people could not. Why outbreaks seemed tied to trade and movement of goods. Why ships often carried death to new ports. Why crowded, unsanitary cities suffered so much more. With this knowledge, modern medicine developed tools to fight the plague. Quarantine, pest control, and later, antibiotics, turned what was once a civilization-shattering disease into something treatable. Global shifts. The long-term consequences of the Black Death reached far beyond Europe. In the Middle East, population loss weakened economies and empires. In Asia, dynastic shifts, like the fall of the Yuan and rise of the Ming, were accelerated by plague devastation. In the Americas, when Europeans arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they carried not plague but other diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, that would decimate indigenous populations just as the Black Death had ravaged Europe. In this sense, the plague was part of a broader story, disease as one of the great forces shaping human history. Long-term lessons. 1. Fragility of civilization. The Black Death showed how quickly societies could crumble when faced with invisible threats. Political systems, religions, and economies proved powerless before nature's fury. 2. Resilience of humanity. Despite unimaginable losses, humanity adapted. From the ruins of plague, Europe saw the decline of feudalism, the rise of cities, and eventually the Renaissance. 3. The role of disease in history. Wars and kings dominate textbooks, but disease may have shaped the world just as profoundly. The Black Death was a silent conqueror, redrawing the map of power and society. Faith, doubt, and reform. The plague didn't kill religion, but it changed it. The Church's failure to protect people eroded blind trust. This skepticism laid the groundwork for Martin Luther's Reformation in the 16th century. Without the Black Death weakening the Church's aura of invincibility, Europe might not have been ready to challenge Rome. The hidden winners. Though tragedy dominated, some groups found unexpected opportunities. The women, with so many men gone, women inherited property, ran businesses, and in some cases, gained more independence. Peasants, labor shortages gave them bargaining power. For many, life after the plague offered freedoms unthinkable in the rigid feudal system. Merchants and traders, with old systems broken, they rose to new prominence, laying the foundation for modern capitalism. Memory in art and culture. Even centuries later, the plague haunted Europe's imagination. Skeleton dances, skull motifs, and grim tales became part of culture. Writers, poets, and painters explored themes of death, survival, and hope. Folk songs and oral traditions kept alive the memory of the time when death walked among us. In this way, the Black Death shaped not just history but also the way people thought about life and meaning. The plague today. Surprisingly, the Black Death never fully vanished. Even today, small outbreaks of Yersinia pestis occur in parts of Africa, Asia, and the western United States. The difference is that modern medicine can treat it with antibiotics, something unimaginable to medieval people. What was once apocalyptic is now controllable. The Black Death's true legacy. When we look back, the Black Death was more than a tragedy. It was a turning point. It destroyed the medieval world but cleared the way for something new. It reshaped economies. It challenged religion. It sparked cultural rebirth. It revealed the power of disease to alter the course of history. Without it, Europe's path to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and even modern science might have been very different. The Black Death remains one of the most terrifying chapters in human history. Yet, paradoxically, it was also one of the most transformative. From the shadow of death, new worlds of art, science, and exploration emerged. The medieval age ended, and the seeds of the modern world were sown. In the end, the Black Death reminds us of a truth both humbling and empowering. Human history is shaped not only by kings and battles, but by the unseen forces of nature. And in the face of devastation, humanity endures, adapts, and rebuilds.